A day after President Biden suggested that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was not doing enough to secure a ceasefire in Gaza, the Israeli leader responded with a high-stakes move, sending his military aid to Moscow to seek Russian assistance in negotiations with Hamas. This unexpected diplomatic shift underscores the delicate balance of international relations as the US grapples with the consequences of its own public criticisms. Major General Roman Goffman, Netanyahu's military envoy, arrived in Moscow on Wednesday in a bid to leverage Russia's influence in the Middle East, particularly in negotiating the release of hostages held by Hamas. The move highlights Israel's growing impatience with Washington's approach and its willingness to engage with other global powers, potentially complicating the Biden administration's efforts to mediate a ceasefire. Meanwhile, the US Justice Department took a significant, albeit largely symbolic, step by announcing criminal charges against Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar and other senior militants for their roles in the deadly October 7th attacks in Israel.
Today, the Justice Department unsealed charges against Yahya Sinwar and other senior leaders of Hamas for financing and directing a decades-long campaign to murder American citizens and endanger the security of the United States. As outlined in our complaint, those defendants, armed with weapons, political support, and funding from the government of Iran and support from Hezbollah, have led Hamas's efforts to destroy the state of Israel and murder civilians in support of that aim.
The charges, which include conspiracy to provide material support to a foreign terrorist organization and conspiracy to murder U.S. nationals, mark the first formal effort by American law enforcement to hold the masterminds of the attack accountable.
In its attacks over the past 3 decades, Hamas has murdered or injured thousands of civilians, including dozens of American citizens. In the early morning hours of October 7th of last year, Hamas, led by these defendants, committed its most violent, large-scale terrorist attack to date. During the attack, Hamas terrorists murdered civilians who tried to flee and those who sought refuge in bomb shelters. They murdered entire families. They murdered the elderly, and they murdered young children. They weaponized sexual violence against women. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists murdered nearly 1,200 people, including over 40 Americans, and kidnapped hundreds of civilians. They perpetrated the deadliest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust.
Attorney General Merrick Garland emphasized the U.S. government's broader strategy against Hamas. However, the practical impact of the charges remains limited, as Sinwar is believed to be hiding in Gaza's extensive tunnel network, and several other defendants named by the Justice Department are thought to be dead.
This weekend, we learned that Hamas murdered 6 more hostages, including Hersh Goldberg Poland, a 23-year-old Israeli American. We are investigating Hersh's murder and each and every one of the brutal murders of Americans as acts of terrorism. We will continue to support the whole-of-government effort to bring the Americans still being held hostage home. The charges unsealed today are just one part of our effort to target every aspect of Hamas's operations. These actions will not be our last. The Justice Department has a long memory. We will pursue the terrorists responsible for murdering Americans and those who illegally provide them with material support for the rest of their lives.
The White House, caught off guard by Netanyahu's diplomatic pivot, quickly sought to reaffirm its commitment to securing a ceasefire. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre assured reporters that the administration was working around the clock to achieve peace, even as tensions between the U.S. and Israel appeared to deepen.
Look, the president sees the prime minister as someone he has known for some time now, for decades. They tend to have honest conversations, direct conversations. I'm going to not get into a yes or no here. I'm going to get into what I know their relationship to be. And I think that's what's important. The president wants to get this done, and I'm just going to leave it there.
Biden's remarks, made during an impromptu exchange with reporters, have drawn mixed reactions within Israel, where public opinion is sharply divided. While some Israelis accuse Netanyahu of failing to protect hostages, others support his strategy of maintaining military pressure on Hamas, arguing that it will ultimately force the militant group to capitulate.
Mr. President, do you think it's time for Prime Minister Netanyahu to do more on this issue? Do you think he's doing enough?
No.
With Israel looking to Russia for support and domestic criticism of Netanyahu mounting, the US must carefully balance its diplomatic efforts to avoid further alienating its key ally in the Middle East. Meanwhile, clashes erupted on September 3rd night between Palestinian protesters and Israeli soldiers in the city center of Jenin. The Palestinian Red Crescent said Israeli forces were blocking their ambulances from reaching the wounded. The clashes come as Israel continued its six-day raid on the Jenin refugee camp in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Israel says it has killed 14 militants in Jenin and arrested 25 militants. Palestinian health officials say at least 29 people have been killed, including 5 children. Israel has described the West Bank operation as a strategy to prevent attacks on Israeli civilians, which have increased during the war in Gaza, including near settlements that the international community largely considers illegal.